In May 2008, 40-year-old Wilco Van Rooijen and his six-man team set out to climb the K2 mountain, which lay between the border of China and Pakistan. Along with a dozen other brave climbers, their goal was to reach the summit and make it back down in one piece. The 14-day climb started out great. Despite a few bumps along the way, they finally made it to the summit. However, later that same night, they were faced with an unpleasant surprise resulting in a battle for survival. This is the beginning of a tragic tale that would echo on even for decades to come. This is the story of the K2 disaster, 2008. As a child, Van Rooijen loved adventure and always welcomed a good challenge. He had a wonderful childhood where he would often walk with his parents along the Alps, admiring the high and gigantic mountain structures. He would often wonder what it felt like to reach the top of this mountain range. Throughout his childhood, he cherished that same thought and ambition. When he was 16, he started mountain climbing. As a teenager, he was consumed by his new hobby and wanted to know everything about climbing, ropes, and knots. Any mountain he came across, despite the dangers, he wanted to climb. His goal was to become the best mountaineer there ever was. But like most parents, Van Rooijen's parents wanted him to get a good education and degree, so he followed in his father's footsteps and started studying engineering. Right after graduation, he knew that this was not the right path for him. Mountain climbing was his first and only love. He could not imagine doing anything else, so he decided to take it up again. He traveled around the world to climb mountains, but before long, he realized that these trips were expensive. Together with his friend, he repaired houses and worked hard to gain more financial stability so he could pay for his rather expensive hobby. By the time he was in his late 30s, he had climbed most of the world's great mountains. He had reached the North and South Poles, climbed Mount Everest, and more. He traveled the world talking about his adventures and exploits, but unfortunately, he found that most people liked tragic stories more. One mountain Van Rooijen really wanted to climb again, Mount K2. He had made two previous attempts to reach the summit of K2 in 1995 and 2006. Both attempts were unfortunately unsuccessful. He continued to cherish the dream of reaching the summit and decided to make another attempt. Mount K2 is located on the border between China and Pakistan. It is the second highest mountain on Earth after Mount Everest, with a height of 8,611 meters above sea level. Like several other mountains above 8,000 meters, K2 is one of the most dangerous and difficult mountains to climb. Only 305 people have ever reached the summit. Unfortunately, at least 75 people have lost their lives. If Van Rooijen attempted the K2 again, it would perhaps be one of the most dangerous climbs of his life, but he was ready, or so he thought. Finally, in mid-May 2008, alongside a team of 6, Van Rooijen left behind his wife Helene and his 7-month-old son Taeyoon for his redemption adventure, climbing Mount K2. Throughout the journey to Mount K2, his excitement mounted. He simply could not wait. After a quick pep talk at the foot of the mountain, the expedition began, and it was much tougher than Van Rooijen remembered. The last time he tried to climb K2, he couldn't make it to the finish line. He had seen many of his friends and colleagues lose their lives while climbing. He had a wife and infant son at home, and his only wish was to return to them in one piece. As they climbed, they found some other explorers climbing alongside too, including an incredibly brave newlywed couple, a jolly Irishman, and dozens others. The more people, the better, Van Rooijen thought. The climb was grueling, and the cold hit harder the higher they climbed. It was so tough that one of the climbers gave up before they were even halfway up and turned around. Van Rooijen understood. He was once like that too. But when they were halfway up, something terrible happened. One of the climbers, a Serbian, was detaching himself from the ropes to pass them to another climber when he slipped and then fell over. Van Rooijen held out his hand to save him, but in a split second, under loud screams, the Serb was gone. A few minutes later, the Serbian's porter also slipped and fell. A fall from this height would be too violent to recover the body. The entire group of scouts froze in their tracks as they processed what had just happened. But there was no time to reflect or grieve. After all, they were still in danger themselves. So they decided to continue their trek, and slowly but surely, they reached the top of K2. It was a dream come true for Van Rooijen, who had proved to himself and the world that he could do it. Despite 2 failed attempts to climb K2, he had finally succeeded. He pulled out his camera to capture the amazing moment. He took beautiful pictures of the scenery and the breathtaking view. Despite exhaustion and weakness, he still took some pictures of himself at the summit. One day he thought to himself, these pictures would inspire my son. That same night, the majority of those who made it to the top decided to descend to Camp 4, a few hundred meters from the summit. Van Rooijen had to make a difficult decision. He could follow them that same night or wait and begin his descent the next morning. After some thought, he decided to descend a few hours later that night. 4 of his team members agreed with him and decided to wait a few more hours. He was convinced he made the right decision, but unfortunately, he was wrong. Very wrong. By the time they were ready to leave, an avalanche had cut their ropes and there was no way they could get down now. They were in trouble, big trouble. Around this time, Van Rooijen began to regret his decision, and as he glanced from one team member to the next, he prayed and hoped that they would all make it out of this alive, even if it seemed highly unlikely at the time. The next day, clouds had descended and covered the top of the mountain. Visibility was very poor. He was on his own. The summit of K2 was both a bottleneck and the most dangerous part of the mountain, the death zone. He had to descend as soon as possible or he would die. Without ropes, the descent would be much riskier, but he had no choice. All he had to do was make it to Camp 4, just some meters below the peak. His other team members would be waiting for him there. Little by little and as meticulously as he could, Van Rooijen began to descend the death zone. He progressed very slowly, but the important thing was that he was moving forward. It was cold and hard to see anything. One small misstep and he would be lost. That thought stayed in the back of his mind, and so he tried to think of his wife and infant son back home as much as possible. He needed inspiration to stay alive and especially to keep moving. A few hours later, he became snowblind and was too tired and weak to continue. He had his satellite phone with him, but he could not reach anyone to call for help because he could not read the numbers on the phone. It was snowing too heavily, and in addition, clouds also obstructed his vision. He realized he could go no further. Van Rooijen would fall before he knew it, so he found a small spot and decided to sit there. The cold descended on him. He was thirsty and delirious, and then the hallucinations began. First, he heard voices and saw people climbing past him. He called and signaled to them for help, but no one stopped to help him. He didn't realize it at the time, but in reality, no one was there. He was hearing and seeing things and was almost dead. All the odds were against him now. If he stayed like this, he would surely pass away, he thought to himself. So he gathered his reserve strength and forged ahead. Only a few minutes later, he came across 3 other people. He was happy to see them, but paused for a moment. This could be another hallucination, but it wasn't. The 3 people were real and were part of the other explorers that had decided to descend the previous night. They were not in good shape. The Koreans were tangled in their ropes, hanging upside down in the snow, slowly slipping into permanent unconsciousness. One of them could speak, and he told Van Rooijen that the avalanche had been so bad that about 9 of those who had left the previous night had been swept away. Van Rooijen's eyes widened in shock. His team, were they okay? Before the Korean could answer, he drew his last breath, and just like that, he was gone. The silence was deafening. Van Rooijen was determined. He was not going to die here today. For his wife, for his son, he would hold on and make it out alive. So he forged ahead. Soon after, it began to get dark again, and he had to stop. He closed his eyes, and the next time he opened them, it was a brand new day. He had survived another night. He got up on his feet and focused on surviving. Memories of his family filled up his mind. No one knew where he was. No help was coming. For everyone else, he probably would have fallen and not survived. He had to and would survive. His goal was to climb to Camp 4, hoping that some of his teammates had survived. At one point, he could no longer feel his face or toes. His legs trembled and his eyes failed. So far, he had survived 3 whole days on the mountain with little water and no ropes. Finally, he made it to the camp and some of his teammates rushed to help him. He hoped it wasn't another hallucination, And fortunately, it wasn't. Only 2 of them had survived. They helped get him to safety. A few weeks later, Van Rooijen sat in his cottage in Holland telling his story to the media and anyone who would listen. 11 lives had been lost that day, and it was the most tragic expedition he had ever experienced. He lost 2 toes to frostbite, but he survived and was more energetic and vibrant than ever. But the question remains, will he ever climb again, or will he take the tragedy on K2 in 2008 as a sign to stop and focus on his family? If you have followed this story to this point, I would like to say a big thank you. If you like this kind of story, don't forget to hit the like button and leave a comment below. For more of this type of content, please click on the subscribe button and turn on your notification bell so you will be notified when another video is posted. Until next time, be cautious and don't ever lose your sense of wonder.